She was brought to him in a fortress at the edge of the known world, not as a prisoner, not as a gift, as a captive of war who had not yet been touched. And that distinction, in the ancient world, meant everything. Outside the walls of the rock fortress of Sogdiana, the bodies of its defenders were still cooling. Alexander had taken it in a siege that his own generals had called impossible. He had taken it anyway. Inside, among those who surrendered, was a girl. Her name was Roxana. She was the daughter of a Bactrian nobleman named Oxyates. She was, by every account that survived, extraordinarily beautiful. And Alexander, conqueror of Persia, destroyer of Darius, master of an empire that stretched from Greece to the Hindu Kush, looked at her and made a decision that stunned every man in his court. He would not take her. He would marry her. What happened in the years that followed, the war, the isolation, the pregnancy, the murder, is a story history has mostly left in the margins. This is what was actually there. If this is the kind of history you want, subscribe to this channel. There is also something called Beyond the Story waiting at the end of this video. You will not want to leave before it. Bactria was not the edge of the world. It only looked that way from Greece. To those who lived there, it was the center of everything. A land of high mountain passes, deep river valleys, and cities that had stood for centuries before Alexander was born. It sat at the crossroads of trade routes that connected India to Persia, Persia to the steppes of Central Asia. Its people were riders and fighters. Its nobility was proud and old, and not easily impressed. Oxyates was one of its most powerful lords. He had fought against Alexander. When the resistance collapsed, he had retreated with his family to the rock fortress of Sogdiana, a natural stronghold so sheer and so high that its defenders reportedly laughed when Alexander's messengers arrived to demand surrender. They told him to find soldiers with wings. He found them. He called for volunteers willing to climb the cliff face at night using iron tent pegs driven into the ice. 300 men made the ascent. 30 fell to their deaths in the dark. The rest reached the summit at dawn, and the fortress fell before its defenders fully understood what had happened. Among those taken was Roxana. She was young. The sources disagree on exactly how young, but she was not yet a woman by the standards of her world. She was the daughter of a man who had just been defeated. In the logic of ancient conquest, her fate should have been straightforward. Alexander changed the logic. The marriage was not romantic in the way later centuries would paint it. It was political in a way that Alexander's own generals struggled to accept. He was trying to hold Bactria. The region had resisted him longer and more fiercely than almost anywhere else in his campaign. The Persians had fallen. Egypt had welcomed him. But Bactria and Sogdiana, the lands beyond the Hindu Kush, had bled him for 2 years. Guerrilla warfare, ambushes, fortresses that had to be taken one by one from men who knew the terrain and had nothing left to lose. Marrying Roxana was a statement. It told the Bactrian nobility that Alexander was not simply a conqueror passing through. He was planting himself here. He was taking their blood into his line. He was, in the language they understood, becoming one of them. Oxyates, her father, became one of Alexander's most loyal commanders almost immediately after the wedding. The strategy worked. The region stabilized. Alexander moved east toward India, and Roxana moved with him. She was now queen of the largest empire the world had ever seen, a title that meant, in practice, that she traveled with an army across deserts and mountain ranges and river crossings that killed men by the hundreds. She was far from Bactria, far from her language, her people, her world, surrounded by Macedonian men who had not wanted this marriage and did not hide it. Alexander's oldest companions, Hephaestion, Craterus, Ptolemy, had watched their king marry a barbarian girl from a conquered province and set aside the political alliances that a Macedonian marriage would have secured. They said nothing openly. They did not need to. Roxana understood exactly where she stood. India nearly broke Alexander. His army mutinied at the Hephaestus River in 326 BCE. the furthest point east they would reach. They had been marching for 8 years. They refused to go further. Alexander, for the first time in his life, turned back. The return journey was catastrophic. He led part of his army through the Gedrosian Desert, a crossing so brutal it killed more of his men than any battle had. Heat, no water, no food. Soldiers, camp followers, women, dying in the sand while Alexander pushed forward. Roxana survived it. She was pregnant by the time they reached Babylon in 323 BCE. Alexander was 32 years old. He had conquered everything he had set out to conquer, and was already planning the next campaign, Arabia, then perhaps the Western Mediterranean. He was not finished. Then in June of 323 BCE, he fell ill after a banquet. The fever did not break. For 10 days, his generals gathered outside his chamber. His army filed past his bed to see him one last time. He could no longer speak. When they asked him who should inherit his empire, says he answered, "The strongest." He died on the 10th or 11th day of June, 323 BCE. He was 32 years old. Roxana was carrying his child. In a single moment, she went from queen of the world's largest empire to a widow in a foreign court, surrounded by men who each believed they had a better claim to what Alexander had left behind than the unborn child of a Bactrian woman. She had perhaps 6 months before the child arrived, 6 months to survive. She moved first. Alexander had taken a second wife in 324 BCE, Statera, the daughter of Darius III, the Persian king he had defeated. The marriage had been political, part of a mass wedding at Susa, where Alexander's senior officers had also taken Persian brides. Statera was royal by blood in a way Roxana was not. If Statera was also pregnant, or if she produced a son, Roxana's child, and Roxana herself, became expendable. Roxana had Statera summoned to Babylon under a forged letter bearing Alexander's seal. Statera came. She and her sister were killed. Their bodies were thrown into a well. The ancient sources record this without much elaboration. It is stated as a fact. Roxana arranged it. It was done. She gave birth to a son. He was named Alexander IV. For a moment it appeared she had won. The child was Alexander's heir. The generals, the Diadochi, the Successors as history would call them, recognized the boy as king. Roxana, as his mother, held a position no one could easily remove. But the Successors were already dividing the empire among themselves. Perdiccas, who held the regency, was assassinated within 2 years. Antipater took control, then Cassander. The boy king was moved, managed, kept alive as a symbol, while real power passed between men with armies. Roxana moved with her son from court to court, from protector to protector, always dependent on whoever held power at that moment. She had no army, no territory, no allies she could trust beyond the child she had fought to protect. Cassander imprisoned them in 317 BCE. He placed Roxana and the boy Alexander IV under guard at Amphipolis in Macedonia, far from Bactria, far from Persia, far from anywhere Roxana had ever called home. They were kept alive because the boy was still useful as a symbol. They were kept imprisoned because a living heir to Alexander's empire was also a threat to every man who had carved a piece of it for himself. Alexander IV was recognized as co-king of Macedonia alongside the mentally incapacitated Philip III Aridaeus. When Aridaeus was killed in 317 BCE, the boy became the sole legitimate heir to everything his father had built. Cassander had him killed in 310 or 309 BCE. The boy was approximately 13 years old. Roxana was killed at the same time. The sources do not record how. They record only that it was done, and that Cassander concealed the deaths for a period before they became known. The ancient sources remember Roxana mostly as a detail in Alexander's story. A bride taken in a conquered fortress, a widow who acted quickly, a mother who could not protect her son. But she outlasted nearly every person who had power over her life. She outlasted Alexander. She outlasted Perdiccas. She outlasted Antipater. She outlasted Philip III. She survived a decade in the wreckage of the largest empire the ancient world had ever seen, with nothing but her son and her own calculation to keep her alive. What she could not outlast was a man with an army and no reason left to keep her. The question the record does not answer, and perhaps cannot, is whether she knew, in those final years at Amphipolis, that it was coming. Whether she had run out of moves, or whether she was still looking for one. History remembers the men who divided Alexander's empire. It barely remembers the woman who fought inside it longer than almost any of them. If this is the kind of story you want more of, the ones that survive in the margins, the ones history almost let go, subscribe to this channel. There are more of them here, and the next one is already waiting. Beyond the story. The rock fortress of Sogdiana, the place where Roxana and Alexander first met, has never been definitively located. Scholars have placed it in several sites across modern Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. The cliff face that 300 Macedonian soldiers climbed in the dark, the summit where a girl was taken and a king made a decision that altered the course of his empire. It is still out there, somewhere in the mountains of Central Asia, unmarked and unnamed. The moment happened, the place has been lost.